Thank you, everyone who's here. My name is Rachel Brown. I'm the Executive Director at Over0, and I'm very excited for everyone to join us for another seminar in our series on countering online hate and its offline consequences. This series is hosted by the Media and Peace Building Project at George Washington's School for Media and Public Affairs, along with Over0 and in partnership with the World Bank. Each seminar in this series covers individual chapters in a forthcoming book on the same topic, countering digital hate and its offline consequences. Our hope for these seminars and for this book more broadly is to merge insights from cross-disciplinary research and global practice to spotlight a spectrum of interventions and broader reforms that can be implemented to mitigate the spread and offline impact of hate speech in conflict-fragile settings. So for today's seminar, I'm very excited. We are joined by David Nyham and Vefa Veselova, and they will be presenting on their chapter, Early Warning and Responses to Hate Speech and Divisive Narratives in Fragile and Conflict-Affected Contexts. This chapter really focuses on how hate speech has or has not been considered as part of different types of early warning and response systems. It raises different conceptual and analytical challenges for early warning and response systems in relation to hate speech. And it places hate speech in the context of broader narrative frameworks to enable us to think differently about how it might be integrated into early warning and response. For a little bit about the authors who really do embody this merging of research and practice, David is the executive chairman of the International Conflict and Security, INCUS Consulting Limited, which works at the nexus of sustainability, peace, and security. He's worked for over 25 years on conflict resolution, political mediation, corporate risk and issues management in over 30 fragile and conflict-affected countries. He's been part of the very first non-governmental dialogue efforts between Chechen proxies and the Russian government during the late 90s. Process that was designed and implemented effective national and subnational dialogue in Georgia, Indonesia, Mauritania, Fiji, and Kyrgyzstan. And he's also successfully worked with companies in disputes with local communities and armed groups in Nigeria, Iraq, and Guinea. Vefa is a corporate communications and strategy expert with more than 25 years of hands-on international and leadership experience from established companies. Her core expertise is in media and reputational issue management, strategic and crisis communications, reputation management in challenging stakeholder environments, and international media profiling. As a consultant, she works especially to support clients on strategic communications, public dialogue, and trust building. So I will pass to them for a presentation. At the end, we will have time for question and answer. So if questions are emerging for you as they speak, please do use the chat to write them down, and I'll keep an eye there. So with that, over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. I'll share my screen and hopefully internet Wi-Fi works. I keep getting messages that it's unstable. So if you see that, the line is bad, please let me know and I'll switch off my video.
Perfect.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Excellent, great. Well, thank you again, Rachel, for hosting this webinar.
Vefa, can you put it on projection mode? So bottom right, there's a...
Yes.
There you go, perfect.
I should know this. Okay, there we go.
Thank you.
Okay. Again, Rachel, thank you so much for organizing this webinar, and thank you very much to everyone who is joining us. And as Rachel said, we will be talking about hate speech and early warning responses and early warning systems and responses, as well as divisive narratives in fragile and conflict-affected context. We will not be, we were thinking of giving some background to ourselves, but Rachel has kindly done so. So we'll just start with the presentation. So today we will be focusing on the following. We will be talking about hate speech at the origins of early warning. And we will be talking about a specific case, the Rwandan genocide. And then we'll be looking at what is early warning and response and the three systems generations, as well as hate speech and how it is used as a weapon of war. We will be reflecting on why has hate speech not been integrated well into early warning and response systems. And then we'll be talking about framing hate speech in conflict settings, trying to see whether or not gaps can be bridged. And finally, we'll be talking about integrating hate speech into early warning and analytical models and response toolbox. So I'll pass the microphone to David now. And David, here you go.
Yeah, thank you. Many of you in this webinar may recall the Rwandan genocide in 1994. And perhaps not so many know that this was really a seminal event when it comes to how contemporary conflict early warning came about, very much as a response to the failure of the international community to respond to that genocide. What is interesting is that in that genocide, I think we saw one of the early, not only strategic uses of hate speech, but also tactical uses of hate speech to perpetrate mass violence and genocide. And that was done then through two radio stations that are quite well known in the story of the Rwandan genocide, Radio Mille Collines and Radio Rwanda. The way that violence was perpetrated and hate speech was used was interesting, and the transcripts of these radio broadcasts during the genocide make for a very harrowing and interesting read. But basically, what they did and the way they used hate speech and made it effective was by putting it within a narrative that mixed the outside threat of the Rwanda Patriotic Front with a Tutsi plot and the presence of traitors then, including moderate Hutu politicians within the transitional government. So hate speech was inserted in that broader context. What is interesting is why, therefore, given the prominence of hate speech in the Rwandan genocide, that early warning systems, particularly first and second generation systems that came about afterwards, did not really use or integrate hate speech as a predictor of violence in violent conflict settings. Next slide, please. Now, before we get into that, for those of you who are new to early warning and some of the concepts that we'll be talking about, I'll just give a brief refresh on what that is, including three generations of early warning. Basically, what there is to say on this as a refresher is that early warning and response systems today are very much part of how we do conflict prevention and peace building. From the early starts in the late 90s, early 2000s, today we see a multiplicity of different types of systems that are used to inform how we do conflict prevention, but also to support what we call operational preventive efforts. Conflict early warning, narrowly defined, is about and defined as early warning in isolation, is a process that basically has an alert function related to the outbreak, escalation, and resurgence of violent conflict, and an awareness raising and educational function when it comes to educating decision makers of the nature and impacts of violent conflict. So it's decision analysis in many ways. And for those of you who are familiar with conflict analysis and have seen conflict analysis reports, conflict analysis can be basically seen as a snapshot of a conflict situation, while an early warning system, in a sense, provides through regular reporting and analysis the movie, the constant monitoring of volatile contexts. An early response is then an initiative that occurs as soon as the threat of potential violent conflict is identified, and that has as its aim to manage, resolve, or prevent that violent conflict. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide basically is a very synthesized overview of the different generations of early warning systems that we have seen over time. Some will argue that there are even fourth generation systems. But after the Rwandan genocide, what we saw in terms of first generation systems were systems often within institutions following a centralized structure, focused on prediction and analysis with a view to informed decision-making. So we had these systems emerging in different multilateral agencies, such as the ECOWAS system and in other places. Second generation systems were one that began to use a more decentralized model. Whereas the first generation systems could be, for example, systems in Brussels, covering Africa, or in Abuja, covering the West African subcontinent. Second generation systems, like the IGAD system, began to really move closer to the regions and areas they covered, used much more field monitors, and began to make much more active proposals on response. And the third generation systems that C1 and the IGAD system is one of the early versions of, then basically moved into really being localized and saying that actually, rather than being in Brussels or Abuja, our system should be in the local conflict hotspot where the conflict is happening. And they merged often local monitors with responders, and where information was used as a response. So to give you a very concrete example, when early warning signals were picked up, it could be a rumor or a provocation, the monitors and responders would deploy themselves as fact finders, and by doing so would then reduce local level tensions. So these are much more localized systems, and these systems, interestingly, and I'll talk a bit about it later, have really begun to pick up more on the hate speech element than first and second generation systems. Next slide, and over to you, Vivi.
Yes. Now I will be talking about how hate speech is used as a weapon of war. And I think it's very timely now to speak about divisive narratives, because as we know, divisive narratives in general, and hate speech are part and parcel of how war is waged. And in almost, of course, all wars are different and they're unique in their ways, but they all have something in common. They all have multiple narratives, and they are constructed and they are resourced by different groups. And these are groups also not only part to the conflict, but also groups that are not party to the conflict. That this could be NGOs, or it could be media as well. Beyond Rwanda, as David was talking earlier, we also see this in the Balkans, North Caucasus, the wars in Karabakh, and also today during the war in Ukraine, how hate speech is used as an instrument. And of course, it's important to point out that research shows that there are two types of narratives in societies dealing with a conflict. There is a dominant narrative, which is in a way, it represents a socially shared belief system, such as justness, fear for security, but also it highlights the victimization of one's group and so on. But there's also alternative narratives, which help to identify new beliefs and approaches to resolve the conflict, as well as develop reconciliation tools and methods. And I think it's important to highlight that in most literature, psychological literature, alternative narratives are also called fringe narratives, because it's oftentimes they get less attention in society, but also there is a lot of awareness of these narratives among the mainstream, and they are seen as a threat to national cohesiveness as well. And it is also important to highlight that with the advent of radio and television, as well as now social media, where information spreads instantly, the use of information, mis and disinformation has become operationally and tactically more significant as instruments of war. David.
Perfect. Okay, so why has hate speech then not been integrated well into early warning and response systems, and particularly first generation systems? And there are a few reasons for that, and part of it relates to time and how organizations, in a sense, embody or begin to use and then entrench certain practices. And the first one, when you look at a number of the first and second generation systems that are out there, is that they used predictive models that are focused on the eruption of conflict at the national level, and that were developed 20 years or so, or 10, 15 years ago. And that is significant because it was then at the very beginning of the widespread use of social media and smartphone technology. So these analytical models did not then therefore take into account this development and this phenomenon as fueled by social media and smartphone technology. The second one is a conceptual one, which is how hate speech is framed and understood and contextualized as a predictive indicator for violent conflict. And that conceptualization is still developing. Bahadur's work on this is very good and very helpful, with the categorization of hate speech and in different categories and an intensity scale. But in the context of some of these analytical models that are used, they, for example, look at other things that are or have shown empirically to have predictive value for the determination of the outbreak of violent conflict at national level. So there are some inherent analytical and conceptual issues that mean that hate speech hasn't yet been integrated so well. The other one is, or the other point to make in this context, is that over time, a lot of the analytical models in early warning have shifted more and more to speak to response. And here I'm talking about the qualitative part of early warning, not the predictive quantitative part. So what typically responders ask for when it comes to their systems is analysis or decision intelligence that will tell them what to do. When you look at conflict analysis methods, you can see over time the shift in those methodologies from wanting to really provide an in-depth understanding of the conflict to honing in on some of the issues that different actors can actually tackle. And this journey for hate speech and narrative analysis, I would say, within conflict settings is just starting to begin. The last reason for why hate speech has not been integrated well into early warning and response systems are technical, around data capture. Some of these systems use software and capabilities that haven't integrated big data in a good way, and haven't necessarily been able to capture the vastness of data around hate speech. So that basically means that from a technical perspective, they haven't really been able to capture this as an issue well. Next slide, please. Over to you, Beth.
Thanks, David. So here, I think we'll be talking about framing hate speech in conflict settings. So what do we mean by that? As David was talking about, in the previous slide about why it's been difficult to kind of, in a way, capture hate speech previously, is because perhaps there wasn't enough effort or, kind of intentions to situate hate speech in a broader narrative context. As we know, the way we define and frame a problem is important, because that's when you understand what kind of remedies you need to develop, how you need to address the issue. And also understanding in which context hate speech is being, in a way, developed or situated is important. Therefore, understanding the narratives that are being pushed into various audiences is also very important. And as we saw from the Rwandan genocide and also numerous other cases, for example, as we spoke earlier, in the North Caucasus, for example, or in the Balkans, when how Milosevic pushed the in a way, disseminated narratives about the Croatians and the Bosnians, helped set the stage for the outbreak of the war. And similar scenario perhaps happened in Chechnya, when narratives created by the Russians about the Chechens fueled two wars in the 90s. We can go back to the recent history as well, again, where we see competing narratives of Greek and Turkish Cypriots about each other still makes it difficult to find a long-term solution to that conflict. So we see that, we understand that situating hate speech and, in a broader societal narratives is extremely important, because knowing when hate speech is triggered, or it triggers violence and entrenched divisions between opposing groups, can help to perhaps to not only prevent these situations, but also help to develop solutions before the violence. And during the development of this, while we were writing this chapter, we realized that actually it's becoming clear that there is an anatomy of conflict narratives. It includes strategic, operational, and as well as tactical elements. So when we say strategic narratives, it seeks to maintain the legitimacy of actors. And here the main focus is normally on narratives around group origins, historical victimhood, and about the justness and rightness of the cause and overall justification for violent actions. When we talk about operational narratives, here it seeks to mobilize populations around specific political or military objectives, and it focuses normally around narratives of existential threats or territorial claims. And tactical narratives, it provides short-term fuel for operational and strategic narratives, and hate speech features here prominently, but also other less extreme and less violence inducing narratives as well. We kind of see stories such as why a peace process failed, or memes about opposing leaders. So situating hate speech in a broader narrative, as I said, it can help to open for entry points to address it at a more strategic level, and also help to promote peace beyond a focus on just managing the violence. And a good early warning analysis of this phenomenon helps to recognize that hate speech and enabling narratives are constructed and resourced, and they do play an important role both in the outbreak and escalation of the violence, but as well as undermining peace and reconciliation. And as David was saying earlier, talking about qualitative analysis, not just quantitative approach, it can help to kind of analyze the hate speech in a way that it can help to generate insight on conflict narratives and hate speech as well. Over to you, David.
Thank you. So the last two slides that we have are basically slides about the analytical model that emerged from our work on this chapter, as well as the response toolbox, in a sense, or the response framework that we see can be helpful when it comes to integrating hate speech into early warning and response. So this slide basically gives you a number of parts that you've already heard about earlier. So some of the key analytical assumptions that we feel need to be front and center. The first one being that these narratives and this hate speech is actively constructed and resourced. So it's there's intent and capability behind it. And secondly, that hate speech itself is made more effective when it has a conducive dominant narrative framework. If the dominant narrative framework is not conducive, then hate speech becomes jarring for large parts of the population. Similarly, another assumption is that we need to approach hate speech not only with the intent of preventing the outbreak of violence, but also with the intent of stopping the erosion of the social fabric that sustains peace and the potential for reconciliation in conflict settings. Then we have the different narrative types that I believe are important to consider. Dominant, alternative, moderate, and alternative extremist, which Vefa just spoke about. And then the purpose of a strategic level, an operational level, and a tactical level analysis of these narratives and this hate speech. And I won't go in detail there because it's in a sense written on the screen. And lastly, the analytical methods that can be used. So that's on the analytical model. Next slide, please. This one's a little bit smaller, but this is basically around the response toolbox towards divisive narratives and hate speech. So again, a set of response assumptions in terms of how you define and approach interventions. So we're basically saying that one of the key assumptions is that you need to approach and tackle hate speech in the context of a broader conflict narrative, and that you need to then have explicit conflict management and peace building objectives related to that or to that approach. So here the point is basically that you don't address hate speech and divisive narratives for the sake of addressing hate speech and divisive narratives. You address them in the context of broader conflict prevention and peace building objectives that you have. Another important assumption is there's often a focus on, when it comes to hate speech, on groups, extremist groups and platforms that perpetuate this hate speech. However, it's very important to be mindful that the conducive narratives that enable hate speech are also promoted unconsciously or inadvertently by media, NGOs, and academics, by moderate groups in these conflict settings. So engaging with these groups is also important to begin to shift and address some of the narratives that create this conduciveness for hate speech. And the last one basically refers to the first, so link it to a broader peace building objectives, but also approach this issue by developing integrated responses to it. Then we have a set of options. So we're not trying to come up with a blueprint here, but just a set of options for strategic, operational, and tactical responses. There are probably many more that can be identified. And the purpose of having these options is basically to stimulate thinking, not to promote one way of approaching it over the other, because every context, of course, is different. And then implementation principles, again, that relate to some of the assumptions that we've put in this slide. And I think importantly in this is to really apply a do no harm lens to all interventions. And not only to the interventions that you define, but also to the impact and approach, to the impacts of your interventions, so that you can adjust your programming and your responses as you see the narrative context evolve. So that's, I think, all we had to share with you. Vefa, anything to add?
No, I think, obviously I probably could have said a bit more about alternative moderate and alternative extremist narratives, but I'll be very happy to answer questions if during the session, if anyone has questions on those specific topics.
And also just to conclude by saying that this is kind of a technical area, and we've given you a bit of a technical and perhaps jargon-filled presentation, but happy to try and break it down and give more examples in the Q&A session. So over to you, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I do see one question in the chat. I have one from myself. Vefa, I would invite you to go into more detail. And I have more than one myself, but I'll give time for others to add. So I see a comment really in the chat about presidents of democratic countries who are using hate speech, and a question about, I guess maybe to put that in the context of early warning and response, how these types of systems could address or consider the role of the messenger, or when it is leadership that is engaged in this behavior, which I imagine relates to some of the work of when leaders are engaged in other types of conflict, risk increasing behaviors. So I don't know if you've had any thoughts on that comment.
I think perhaps if I may jump into it, I think what is interesting when you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict in particular is you see very belligerent, at least on the European side of we are on that side, Vefa. You see very belligerent comments which are by democratically elected leaders, which are very dangerous in a context which involves a conflict with a nuclear power. So there is it's a very valid point, and you see it also in other settings where our leaders are not as mindful perhaps as we would like them to be when it comes to how they address these issues. That's just one to answer that specific one. Vefa, anything on your side?
Yes, I think it's actually a very interesting, very good comment, and I would say that again, what we see is that again, subconsciously or subconsciously, people, leaders that have so many people following them, make statements that leads to division, and they become divisive narratives, and this is exactly what creates, in a way, creates not problems, but makes it difficult for us to resolve conflicts, right? So this is exactly what we're talking about here, that how dominant narratives lead to divisions and make it difficult to build peace. So it's a very valid comment, but I don't have an answer to that, unfortunately.
Great. And I think I just want to also appreciate that this idea of integration into early warning and response systems, right, as an indicator that is incorporated into this framework that is now used across the board as we analyze and assess risk of conflict. So we have a question from Lena about whether you've piloted using social media listening tools in a systemic way, and if there are examples where hate speech monitoring has successfully fed or been integrated into early warning and response systems.
So perhaps I can answer that. I mean, as a consultancy, we operate a bit differently from NGOs who build up systems or multilateral agencies who build up these systems. We do a bit of designing of conflict early warning systems. And where we have been most successful in integrating social media monitoring of not only hate speech, but also provocations and rumor mongering and those kind of more narrative pieces is around early warning systems that have to do with electoral violence. And it's an interesting piece because when you are putting that kind of capability in place, of course, you focus on specific hotspot areas in a country. And there you get into the specific Telegram channels that are used or Facebook pages that are used by specific groups to promote certain narratives and hate speech. What is interesting is the challenge with that. We did one in Ethiopia, and the hotspots, I think we were looking at, there were around 203 hotspots across the country, flashpoints of conflict. There were going to be 16 hubs, micro-level warning and response hubs, dealing with 16 different languages, or more than that, 20 different languages and scripts, right? So just the capability involved of being able to monitor different channels, report and make sense, it's quite substantial. So the practical part of it is tricky. In other places where you have one hotspot or one province or district, it becomes an easier proposition to track and monitor those things. And that's what some of the third generation systems have done more than the first and second generation systems.
Great. We have another question from the chat, and then I know Babak flagged to me that he had a question, so we'll go to him in a moment. But Roland Storti has written that there's the International Fact-Checking Network that deals with dis and misinformation. Which body is qualified to declare a statement as hate speech? And I would guess that this relates to when you're designing an early warning and response system. So yeah, maybe how you define what counts as an early warning, or what is defined as of concern within an early warning and response system, or how you would think about approaching that.
Yeah, I think we would actually ask Babak to speak to that question, because I think he's done very interesting work on the categorizations and intensity levels of hate speech. So I'd be interested to hear his views.
So maybe Babak will go to you and have you ask your question as well.
Okay, certainly. I was going to just follow up to see, if you were to be, let's say, hired for the Ukraine crisis, how would you implement any of your early warning methods? I could talk about the intensity scale a little bit later. I think maybe we'll have you guys are the presenters today, so maybe you could present on this question, if that's okay.
Sorry, Baba, you broke up a little bit on our side here. Your question was what?
I was just wondering, if you were to be hired, let's say, as consultants for the current Ukraine crisis, what are some implementations of your tools that you mentioned that you could potentially implement? Obviously, everyone's concerned about this current issue. Is there any practical implications, practical applications that you could consider?
I think, and I'll ask Vefat also to speak on this, because what is happening in Ukraine now is, on the European side, is that you have, as I mentioned, highly divisive narratives, very pro-Ukrainian narratives, understandably so, because there has been a violation of international law. But in a sense, one that fails to recognize or tackle the alternative moderate discourses that, for example, Chomsky has put out there when it comes to the Ukraine conflict and Russia on the one hand, but also the fact that you are dealing with a conflict between two European countries. Russia is a European country and Ukraine is as well, right? So it's there's a narrative that seeks to push Russia out of the European ambit, so to speak, and that's dangerous in the long run. So if we were to engage on this, which I don't think we would be, because we represent an alternative moderate discourse in this context, but there is a lot of work that needs to be done when it comes to strategic communications and working on building a narrative that brings or sets the stage for future reconciliation in this context. Vefa, your take?
Yes, absolutely. I think, unfortunately, what we're witnessing right now with this conflict and with the other conflicts actually, is that there is a lot of othering taking place. And what is happening is that this othering, this hate speech and imagery, it's just entrenching the gap, and it's just dividing people even further and makes it so difficult to build bridges and to reconcile. I mean, yes, this conflict kind of fresh, right? But if you look at conflicts like Karabakh, say, and it's been going on between Azerbaijan and Armenia for so long, for almost 3 decades. And the reason why I'm referring to this conflict is that it's important to take some learnings from other conflicts and to know how we can find solutions without repeating same mistakes. And unfortunately, what we're witnessing now is that we're repeating same mistakes. And there is a lot of competitive victimhood going on. There is a lot of basic narratives that are being laid out there. They're all divisive. It's just not doing nothing but destroy the potential for peace building. So instead of focusing on on what is happening on the ground, which is important for historical reasons, and I'm not saying that people should not talk about what's happening in Ukraine and should not show all these awful images or everything that's happening currently in Ukraine, but it is also important to focus on common kind of narratives rather than divisive narratives, because there are a lot of things in common between Russians and Ukrainians. So in a way, we have forgotten about it, and all we're doing is we're talking about all the bad things. And I mean, it's very simplified. I'm talking, in a very kind of simple terms here, but important to take the learnings from previous conflicts, like as I mentioned, Karabakh, for example. There was a study where they in a way they spoke to IDPs in Azerbaijan, and they understood that it was very clear that building future together between Armenians and Azerbaijan is possible, and these were the people that suffered the most, because they were the displaced people from their homes. And so it is possible to find common points of contact between dominant narratives in Ukraine and in Russia that can help to set stage for one which recognizes that, yes, actually, it's awful for everyone. It's no one is going to benefit from it. So common narratives, that's what I would say. Moving from divisive narratives to common narratives is probably is a way to go.
Thanks so much. I think it's interesting that we can see this a lot in Zelensky's messaging, speaking directly to Russians, to people. I want to, we have a couple of questions in the chat that steer us back to more the early warning side of things. I know here we're talking about the responses maybe to speech and communication itself, but I think also one of the really interesting propositions in this chapter is that that speech and communication and these broad narratives and how hate speech is situated within them can be a really critical early warning indicator for us to get to signal a risk of conflict and what can be done. We have a couple of very technical questions related to that. We have one follow-up about, in integrating with early warning and response systems, did you use very specific tools like CrowdTangle or TalkWalker? And I'm not sure if that's something, and also about whether there are limitations of the tools. And I'm wondering, I know that's a very technical set of questions, so I just want to add on to that as well. If you, I think, to help bring to life even further for everyone, and maybe using example, the Carbach or other example of, if this early warning, if where speech and communication are integrated into early warning systems with this type of detection capability, what does that afford us in terms of the ability to prevent and respond? That makes sense. So what are some of the technical pieces and their limitation, and when it's done well, what does that enable that is outside of the realm of current capabilities in these systems?
Right. So on the, if I may start, then on the specific technical applications of these tools, I'm not qualified to speak because I don't know them that well. But what I have seen in terms of examples and the value of them, challenges and value. The first one is that when it comes to what triggers violence, it is very culturally specific, depending on the context, the history of the conflict, etc. So, in the Eastern Province in Sri Lanka back in the days, when there was still a conflict in the north and in the Eastern Province, one of the key tension points between Tamils and Muslims was around behavior against women and violence against women. So even a small incident or a rumor that said that, these schoolboys coming back from school had harassed, these two Muslim girls would trigger a response, right? So when, and it relates, I think, a bit to, when you call hate speech, or when hate speech becomes a trigger of violence, it is very difficult to capture that, unless you're at the very, very local level and have a system that is focused on a specific, narrow geographical scope. So that's one comment. The value is in speed. Often what we see is that when a rumor like the one I mentioned is left unaddressed for, 8 hours, boom, you get an incident. You get a crowd that comes together and that goes and, burns down a house or beats up a family, or, and then it escalates and flares up. So the value of these systems or of these tools in the context of early warning, particularly for third generation systems, is the ability to capture that information quickly and give the alert. And someone in the know who understands the context would see then the significance of something or the other and would then be able to respond.
I've muted myself. I'd love to ask a follow-up on that relates to some of the sort of different audiences for this book, which include practitioners. It also includes larger multilaterals and groups that are making decisions of where to sort of invest in conflict prevention. And I'm curious, therefore, given the existence of this particular set of capabilities in third generation systems that are more localized, a little harder to scale at the national level, but specified to hotspots. What are your recommendations for thinking about how, on the sort of more multilateral or large organizational side of things, this could be an investment in this could be made both at the more national or regional level and towards localized hotspots? How could these groups be incentivized, or what would you wish for these large multilaterals to sort of change in how they're operating and approaching systems and their own work? to incorporate these insights. And you're still muted.
Thanks, Rachel. So, you know, what is interesting now in this space is not only that you need to monitor effectively narratives and hate speech because they are actively used by groups as weapons of war, right? So if you are not looking at this, you are missing a huge part of the picture. So I think that's an important bit. The other bit is that the projection of response is now possible to do from Brussels, right? Because you are able to reach areas and people through technology that you weren't able to reach in the past. So in the OSINT space, the open source intelligence space, there is a recognition that information and narratives are powerful tools, not only for strategy, but also operational and tactical uses. So in the military and intelligence spaces, they're way ahead of us when it comes to using this for power projection, right? So for some of the multilaterals and bilaterals who have mandates to promote peace and security, it's now important to catch up and not only to capture and get that part of the picture, but also begin to leverage the power projection for peace and for inclusive security, I would say, that you can have with now these instruments and this communications technology. Go ahead.
Rachel, you're mute.
Please, Rafa, you first. It's
Yes.
good thing I was muted.
I was going to say something about media, perhaps how on the ground efforts can be helpful. I think I would say that international organizations and media, international media, has a big role to play in this as well. Very often, you witness or you see situations where members of media come to cover conflicts or travel to countries where the conflict is one side or the other, already with pre-existing views or opinions, and which impacts their coverage of the conflict as well. And it doesn't, when you get a biased coverage of the conflict, it doesn't help the situation on the ground, because it in a way it puts people against each other. And you have, I would say the same thing for international organizations. A lot of those organizations, the European Union, World Bank, and others as well, they organize trainings for journalists on the ground or NGOs. And it is important to ensure that their views, their opinions are, their judgments are not influenced by divisive narratives. And it doesn't matter really, it can be a moderate divisive narrative, but their basic views are not influenced by divisive narratives from both sides. So that would be a big help. And I would answer the same way to John Sim's question in the chat as well, where how do you educate and inform everyday individuals on hate speech? Unfortunately, you cannot educate and train everyone, but you need to start somewhere. And if you start talking about common shared belief system, slowly, and you hopefully will get there at some point of time.
Thank you so much, Rafa. And I was only jumping in to say thank you and actually turn to John's question. So you've answered it beautifully with that. And I think we probably don't have enough time for another question, just looking at the time. So I really want to thank you both so much for this presentation, and to thank everyone, all of the attendees, for the questions and the engagement. And I think I speak for everyone when I say we are really looking forward to this chapter. I know it's been exciting to have a read through. So thank you so much. And I don't know, Babak, if you want to add anything else before we wrap up.
No, just also sending my thanks for your presentation. I was going to, I know we only have 3 minutes left, but I was just going to ask a very, very quick question, if there's time, whether you think there's been any changes in the policy response gap. You know, the problem's always been the response gap for those who are capable possibly of intervening when there is speech, for example, that's showing like it's going to lead to violence. But have you seen any changes over the past 20 years in that response gap from international organizations, other actors?
Very good question. You know, I think what Ukraine shows us is that when it's closer to home, you get more faster response from some of the multilaterals and international organizations that play a role in these kind of contexts. I think, yeah, you know, I'm generally in terms of my outlook on our ability to progress in terms of responding fast to these situations, a bit critical and pessimistic. But I think that the interesting piece now is that the potential for faster response and easier responses is in place with the technology that's there. And I'm sure that over the next few years, we will see that leveraged better and more, hopefully more usefully.
Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you everyone so much. We will look forward to seeing you again at the forthcoming events, and have a wonderful Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.